Welcome to the second Offshore Talk. So in this series of talks, what we try to do is to bring bright minds from different disciplines linked to what we do, so tax avoidance, tax evasion, and all of these interesting topics. And today we have Quinn together with us. We will start with the presentation of his book, then we will have a panel discussion with Gabriel, and then the floor will be open to questions for you. I let the floor to Gabriel to present our speaker, Quinn.
Very briefly, because our speaker needs no introduction. He's a famous Quinn Slobodian, professor of international history at Boston University. His books have been translated in many languages, including most recently the book that we'll hear about today on Crack Up Capitalism. He also has a forthcoming book titled, I love it, Hayek's Bastards. He's very famous for his previous book, Globalists, The End of Empire, and The Birth of Neoliberalism, a really wonderful book, extremely influential. So I really encourage you to read it if you have not already read it, and of course this one as well. Very, very happy to have you. You will have 45 minutes to tell us about this book, and then Q&A with the public and myself. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you absolutely to the whole team here, and Gabrielle and Thomas, and all of you all for coming down here and eating some pastries and baguettes and hearing about how the world is going to hell. I've spent the last couple of days in my role that's been thrust on me by the French media, which is to explain Elon Musk to them, which I will take a holiday from in the next hour and a half, for the most part. We'll see what happens in Q&A. And introduce you more to my recent book. And rather than going through the kind of places it explores, which go from Hong Kong to Singapore to Dubai to Liechtenstein to Honduras and beyond, I'm going to talk a bit more about the analytical approach I was taking and how I hope to help us think differently about the recent past and some of also the political quandaries that we find ourselves confronting. So I think one of the points of my book was to challenge what I think are kind of three assumptions about global history since the end of the Cold War. I would say there are kind of three common sense truisms that get recycled through newspapers and in popular journalism and popular history writing, which are more or less this. One I would call the supranational thesis. In other words, there seems to be an idea that the main direction for governance after the end of the Cold War was upwards. The construction of new institutions that sat on top of nation states, the European Union, NAFTA, the World Trade Organization. So if you're going to tell a big story about global history since 1989, you would say the world was kind of building upwards in its forms of government. Another one I would say would be the end of history thesis. Now cited almost like a Tibetan prayer wheel as something that supposedly dominated everyone's common sense about the world after the Berlin Wall, but I think for a good reason. There was a notion that liberal democracy was the last man standing, so to speak, the last form of politics that would survive the Cold War, and that capitalism and democracy were more or less complementary. They may have, as Martin Wolf describes it, a kind of strained marriage sometimes, but nevertheless it was a marriage that had longevity and would remain the primary, if not the only, form of politics. The last argument I would say, or assumption, would be that despite these new institutions, despite NAFTA, WTO, the nation state was still a relatively stable political container for societies. That this was the end point for human organization. We weren't going to get that much smaller than that, nor were we going to move towards a kind of borderless global world in a proper sense. That the kind of political unit of the nation was still despite it all, the kind of the champion of human social life. So each of these theses are going to be sort of taken on in turn in the course of what I present today. And by way of beginning that sort of challenge, I want to talk a bit about the different approaches I took in the two books that Gabriel mentioned in his introduction. The first book, and I put up the covers because the designers were helpful in sort of capturing the thesis of the books in the iconography that they used in the cover design. Globalists, which came out in 2018, was a way to kind of write a history of what had been called the new constitutionalism, which was an idea that, yes, there was a kind of grid or a patchwork of nation states, but over top of that patchwork of political nation states, there was another set of institutions that protected the right of capital and goods to move more or less freely around the world. That was the thesis of this book. The second book, more recent, is about the sort of the end of that institutional arrangement and the idea that this compact between global economic governance and national sovereignty was beginning itself to kind of unravel and become challenged from within. To tell the story of the globalists, I relied on a couple of categories that were used by my protagonists themselves. So these were kind of actors categories, if you like. They come from Roman law, and they were reborn in international law in the 19th century. And for the thinkers that I explore in the book, they were a helpful way to understand their own political project. So what were those categories? On the one hand was the category of dominium, the notion that the world was a space of property, things, goods, capital. And on the other hand was the principle of imperium, or the idea that the world was a space of states, governments, people. And these two versions of the world are sort of nested within one another. So as I describe, I use the metaphor in Globalists, it's sort of like if you took an orange and you thought about the peel of the orange and then the sort of white pith inside of the orange, they sort of are nested inside of each other. And this, rather than north-south or east-west, is arguably the most important way to think about the problem of the 20th century. How do you make these two principles, which we could think of as the categories of the world, an ever more dependent and interdependent global economy, work with a patchwork of states that is ever more numerous? So there is a kind of tension there, more and more smaller polities, an ever more singular, unitary global economy. The people I describe in the book perceive that directly as the sort of riddle or the puzzle of global economic governance. And I follow them from the 1920s up into the 1990s as they seek a kind of a perfect guardian for what they describe as the constitution that will keep separate the spaces of dominium and imperium, prevent nation states from overstepping their bounds and transgressing the lines of private property, seizing foreign-owned assets, nationalizing things, blocking the free flow of goods. For many of the neoliberal intellectuals I study, the WTO in 1995 looked like the realization of what they saw as the ideal institution to safeguard in a legalized way the freedom of trade and the freedom of capital movements. The allegory that they almost always go back to themselves and that their critics also use against them is the famous one from the Odyssey of Odysseus having himself bound to the mast to avoid being drawn by the songs of the sirens and thus crashing the ship into the rocks. Who are the sirens? Well, according to them, it's the nationalists, the protectionists, the socialists, at different times, the feminists, the environmentalists, all sorts of people who seek a rationality that is, in their mind, disruptive to the most efficient use of the world's resources and an international division of labor. So this metaphor, this allegory, came up again, of course, in 2016 in particular, when people saw Trump, saw Brexit saw the rise of the Alternative for Germany party as this sort of unbinding of Ulysses, right? It seemed that this sort of Ulysses Pact, the constitutional pre-commitment that had governed the world economy, was now starting to come undone. The order of the world was thrashing around and threatening to crash into the rocks. If you take yourself back to 2016 and 17, if you're old enough to remember that, which not all of you are, the headlines were quite apocalyptic, right? I mean, is this the end of the world economy? Is this the moment of disintegration? Why are the world's most powerful nations on a path of self-destruction? At the time, I was not comfortable with that narration. I thought it was misleading. I thought it was overly reliant on analogy to the 1930s. This was also repetitively invoked. We're going back to the 1930s. We're going back to the 1930s. What happened in the 1930s that was formative for neoliberals was indeed the creation of tariff walls, the nationalization of property, the rise of beggar thy neighbor economic policy. And the dominant metaphor was one of a world of globalization as a pendulum swinging now back to a world of nations. And yet, the people who were most active in the project of supposedly cracking up the world order were not actually seeking to withdraw behind ironclad tariff walls. They were not seeking to nationalize privately owned property. In many cases, as I will argue for the rest of this talk, they were seeking to accelerate forms of global competition and actually deepen dynamics of intergroup zero-sum rivalry in ways I'll describe. And it made clear to me that we were trapped in part by our own political geographic concepts. So because we saw the world only in these two modes, either global or national, we didn't have a way of understanding a form of alternative globalization that was actually seeking to accelerate capitalism. Hence, the sort of intellectual journey that launched me on the path to writing the follow-up book. And one way of helping to sort of give a longer canvas for this, or a larger canvas for this, is to think about the 20th century in a different way. So this is a graph of the moments of the emergence of new sovereign polities, new sovereign states across the 20th century. And to my surprise, I actually had to make this graph myself. And I'll tell you, I do not make graphs. I'm in the wrong observatory here, actually. I'm not a data person. I have no ability quantitatively or statistically whatsoever, descriptively, analytically, any kind of statistics. So this, I sweated over this. But nevertheless, the point is more that it didn't exist already, right? I Googled, as I do, graph of new sovereign states in the 20th century. Couldn't find it. Why? Because I think, somewhat confusingly, these three moments are not understood analytically as sharing a common feature. So what are these moments, right? If you look there, 1915, 16, 17, it's the end of the First World War, the breakup of the Habsburg Empire, the end of the Russian Empire, the end of the Ottoman Empire, and new states emerging mostly in East Central Europe, but eventually also in the Middle East. So that's discussed as the end of land-based empires, but usually just something like, the Wilsonian moment in the wake of the First World War. What about the second moment? The biggest spike is 1960, the so-called Year of Africa. This is now the era of the end of overseas, so-called saltwater European empires. We have a pretty good name for this, which is the period of decolonization. And thirdly, in the 1990s, the end of the Soviet Union and the end of the Federation of Yugoslavia produced another spike. What do we call that period? Post-socialist transition, end of the Cold War, breakup of the Soviet Union, dissolution of the Soviet Empire, depending on your author. I have not seen people putting these three moments into conversation with each other, thinking about them as actually qualitatively similar moments and challenges to international order, and in particular, challenges to institutions of global economic governance. To the people that I write about, the nation is a persistent challenge to the interdependence of the global economy. And each of these moments was also a challenge to the idea of an interdependent world economy. And each brought about its own set of institutional solutions or fixes. There was indeed an attempt in the interwar period to knit back together the world economy through the League of Nations. Wonderful books about this now from my close friend Jamie Martin and Patricia Clavin and others. There was indeed an effort in the 1960s and 1970s to push back against post-colonial nations who were imagining national political self-determination as also being economic self-determination, exercising that by nationalizing oil fields, nationalizing mines, and the World Trade Organization, as I describe in Globalists, is pretty clearly an attempt to push back institutionally against that more assertive vision of economic autonomy in the wake of decolonization. So one would think that you would find something similar in the 1990s, that what happens in the 1990s, another moment where you have a bunch of new polities, maybe they want something different than is expected of them by, global transnational capitalist class. And so I guess then we would just expect there to be another round of institution building as an attempt to kind of encase, as I call it, markets to produce some outcomes rather than others. And we did have that. I mean, what I described, WTO, international investment law, other forms of mostly bilateral trade agreements, were indeed institutional supranational fixes for the danger of the nation state. But the thing that ended up opening the door for a new approach for the recent book is that in this third period, there was a new kind of form of political geography that was introduced that had not existed in those previous two moments, which I think you can think of as moments of secession. I mean, I've written about this as the first Great Secession, the second Great Secession, and the third Great Secession. These are moments where states are withdrawing from another larger predecessor state and claiming their own national independence. What do you have that's new by the time of the 1990s? You have the emergence of the special economic zone, the export processing zone. I included here in my masterful Excel spreadsheeting, feel free to call attention to all the ways this is distorting the data or whatever, but simply put, the states that have export processing zone by the 2000s have approached all of them. We have nearly a kind of saturation at some level globally of special economic zones, whereas in the first wave of decolonization, there were almost none of them. A few Puerto Rico, Taiwan, foreign trade zones in the United States. But in other words, there was now another way of solving the problem of the nation in global economic interdependence or global economic governance. Rather than scaling up and figuring out ways to bind sovereigns and prevent certain kinds of economic outcomes and ensure other forms of economic outcomes, now you had a way of scaling down and producing subnational jurisdictions in which you could just bind the state internally in a micro way rather than at the macro or kind of global geographical level. So probably we're at a School of Economics. The idea of a special economic zone is probably familiar to most of the people in the room. But in case it's not, these are small jurisdictions within nations that are granted a different legal status and almost always granted lower levels of taxation, lower levels of labor regulation, and they're created as to incentivize mobile global investment. And I'll tell a little bit of a story of where they come from, but suffice to say, the birth point of the Crack Up Capitalism book that followed Globalists was to say, how did that change neoliberal imagination on the one hand, and how did it change the practice of global economic governance, on the other hand. The arrival of not just this rather crude binary, at least schematically, that governed people's thinking in the universe of intellectuals that I study, but now what you see here in the bottom, which is, this is a world map of special economic zones globally, put together by something called the Adrianople Group, started basically by young anarcho-capitalists who wants to accelerate the number of special economic zones in the world, and now consults with different countries to help them design legislation and to roll out their own SEZs. So you can see now a kind of political geography here that is quite different from just the checkerboard puzzle pieces of the nation state, but it's also not this familiar kind of 90s, early 2000s vision of totally deterritorialized capital that just sort of flows in lasers wherever it wants to go, right? We can see, I think, through the lens of the zone, something more granular about concentrations of attention by policymakers and concentrations of manufacturing, often tax avoidance, and other forms of gaming or playing with arbitrage inside of the global economic landscape. There's a larger image of that to have a look at. And one can say a lot about the concentrations. This is not obviously an even geography. So the premise of this book and the premise of this rest of this talk is that, as with the wrestler Rowdy Roddy Piper putting on the special sunglasses in John Carpenter's film They Live, which allowed him to see that every billboard was just telling him to obey. Once we put on the zone glasses, we can actually start to work our way out of some of these impasses or kind of conundrums, I think, produced by an overly binary understanding of politics that is either global or national. So how do these zone glasses help us see the state of current politics differently? For one thing, I think it helps us, and forgive me if this is all things that you've all taken multiple classes on, and this is super basic, but for a lot of people who try to understand China as rising economic power, and now nearly a peer to the United States in some senses, whether or not it will be able to persist is another question. But often it's discussed, at least in the United States context, as an example of state capitalism, a desire to take over the world, as it's crudely put often on the right, and a desire to have sort of global economic dominance, full stop. So I think there the assumption is false, and it's based on an earlier sort of universalist understanding of global governance that sought to indeed create sort of one law for the world economy on the style of the League of Nations, on the style of the World Trade Organization. I think rather it's more helpful to understand China as proposing a kind of zonal or a nodal model of global economic dominance or global economic influence that doesn't propose sort of a single legalized model of, as with the WTO, dispute settlement. You can bring your problems to a global court and solve it there. They're actually happy to use that when it works in their favor. But I think the more strong side of the expansionist model of China, at least until the kind of roadblock of 2020, was the Belt and Road Initiative, which, if you look at it, has a very a beautiful and symmetrical geography with earlier histories of imperial economic expansion. So the sort of choke points and key harbors and ports that China has invested in and made long-term contracts in some cases, as in the case of Sri Lanka, elegantly 99-year leases on the exact model that China was forced to give up Hong Kong's new territories on a 99-year lease in 1899. They're following the old footprints, the naval outposts, the coaling stations of the British imperial lines from the 19th century, whether it's in Singapore, notably, but also, of course, in Suez and elsewhere. There's a kind of in Chittagong. There's a kind of a repetition and a reverse engineering of the logistical chain according to which the British were also able to sort of exercise global dominance. Not through creating a world court, the British didn't do that in the 19th century either, but through controlling choke points and key nodes along global supply chains. So that's one way to help sort of use the zone to understand better what is happening in terms of the conflict of economic logics. A much more obvious one described in the Crack Up Capitalism book is the example of the long shadow of Margaret Thatcher in the British Conservative Party. So the book begins with this moment where two people fall in love with Hong Kong in 1978. One is Deng Xiaoping, who then begins to use the small experimental site of capitalist competition to open up China from Shenzhen, moving up the coast and eventually across the territory. The other is Milton Friedman, who is enamored with Hong Kong's ability to insulate itself from democratic disruption and pressures because it was, at that time, still a British crown colony. British conservatives who were friends with Milton Friedman and shared his fascination, in 1978-79 started talking openly about how they could bring the Hong Kong model back to England to help revive industrialization and sort of kickstart the British economy in a time of increasing competition. Geoffrey Howe, who was the first Chancellor of the Exchequer for Margaret Thatcher, introduced in Thatcher's first budget a series of free ports along the coast of the UK and enterprise zones in the middle of large cities, which he hoped, as he said, would create small Hong Kongs in places like Liverpool, Glasgow, and London. The only one that worked, so to speak, was Canary Wharf, which now, of course, rivals the City of London as a financial services provider. And it worked, as I described in the book, by creating a space that actually evacuated local democratic oversight. There was a Greater London Council composed of left Labour representatives that wanted a different vision of the docklands, which Thatcher abolished outright. She got rid of the Greater London Council and instead produced the Canary Wharf model, which effectively delivered public funds into private developers' hands and insulated all decision-making from any actual democratic review or oversight. So that was the one that worked, when they loved to point to Canary Wharf and the skyline and say, look, we can do it. We can make new Hong Kongs. But all of the other ones absolutely not only didn't work in the 1980s, but don't work now. So remarkably, Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak had no new ideas for leveling up the UK beyond rolling out again the idea that all you need to do is ring fence a small part of the British coast or a small part of British inner cities, and they will magically turn into new Dubais or Hong Kongs overnight. So this is the Freeport proposition for the UK budget. Most of these were also in the first Thatcher budget as proposed by Geoffrey Howe. And the effect has been basically nothing. So this is the FT from the end of last year. 6 businesses have signed up in UK free ports, in all of those free ports overall. The Office for Budget Responsibility, the independent fiscal watchdog, said in 2021 it expected the impact of free ports on UK GDP to be so small, quote, it would be difficult to discern even in retrospect. So one thing that's already clear here is that the zone is not necessarily all-powerful and sort of actually redirecting all flows of global manufacturing, but it is the most sort of unavoidable meme within policy circles, both in rich countries like the UK, relatively speaking, and if you're a poor developing country, it's unavoidable. You need to be offering a special economic zone to even start the conversation with international funding agencies or with international investors or lenders. Another example, which has become much more topical recently, is within the United States, the proposal that investors and corporations would be able to write the laws for their own municipalities and jurisdictions. This is one moment I will mention Musk. Some of you might have noticed that it was reported recently that he's he is starting what is effectively a new private town in Texas called Starbase, for which he has been offered the ability to write his own laws. So the company town, with which the western frontier was settled, especially up towards the northwest of the country where my family is from in Western Canada. My grandfather was a lumberjack. He worked in logging camps. If he had been working 50 years earlier, he would probably be in a privately owned community in which the money was scrip. It was just created by the company to buy things only inside of the company town without any interchangeability outside of it. So this now is a kind of, I would say, a hyperactive version of the zone model, which is being turned in the United States into a new frontier of privatized governance. The place where I find it almost most effective to trouble the 2016 narrative that the far right and the populist right is a kind of a backlash against globalization and a return to the safe space of the nation is by pointing to some of the people who supposedly best represent that trend and yet who operate in ways very different than one would assume if you take that narrative as read. So Viktor Orban is someone who, if you asked, the average middlebrow press reading person on the street, would be like the figurehead of a backlash, rejection of 1990s style globalization, a desire to, re-embrace the population and save it from the kind of competitive pressures of the world beyond. There's a lot of ways of questioning that, not least by the way that they only function as the back factory for the German automotive industry. But another way to point to it is that they've been creating special economic zones inside of this supposedly holy motherland of Hungary to keep Korean investors in the country because it's very important for them to have one hand both in sort of East Asian supply chains and the other in Central European. So rather than a kind of a rejection of the globalization, this is actually doubling down on the very dynamics of the economic geography we would assume there. Another example is Poland, which under the PIS quite remarkably turned the entire nation into a special economic zone. So within all of Poland, you get special subsidies, tax treatment, and tax holidays, which otherwise would be seen as, this should probably be ringing some alarm bells for people who understand the EU to be a place that has relatively uniform conditions for state aid and investment. Poland and Hungary manifestly breaking the rules of that in principle because of their late arrival into the EU as late accession states. They still have a kind of grandfathered in ability to make inducements that otherwise you wouldn't be able to get away with here in France, for example, even if you wanted to. That notwithstanding, another big fan of special economic zones is two more big heroes of the populist right, Matteo Salvini and Giorgia Meloni. Salvini created a bunch of new SEZs in southern Italy, and Meloni has plans to merge the entire Mezzogiorno effectively into one SEZ that was supposed to happen last year. I guess it's in process this year. Reading some of her rhetoric is very telling, right? I'll just read a bit from this. Meloni hailed the development, saying it represented a step change for the southern economy. The development of the economy in southern Italy is a priority for our government, said Meloni. However, we are convinced that this goal must be achieved by abandoning the logic of welfarism, which does not work, and providing opportunities for work and growth, and making these areas of the country competitive and attractive for investments and businesses. So how is this different at all from the sort of cliche rhetoric of 1990s neoliberalism? It isn't. This could be copy-pasted from McKinsey. It could be copy-pasted from Tony Blair. It could be copy-pasted from Gerhard Schröder. It is the consensus logic of what everyone assumes 90s style neoliberal globalization to be. What does it mean that she is somehow given credibility by some people as a qualitatively different political creature than that which preceded her? A couple of other interesting zones to bear in mind is Putin's Russia, which also takes great advantage of the special economic zone. In fact, the world's biggest free trade zone is the Russian Arctic. They're doing interesting things inside of their special economic zones, including the attempt to bring back the woolly mammoth through DNA manipulation. And I can't remember, it's not called Jurassic Park, but it's called like Pleistocene Park. So they've got a great name for it. So this is not something that is only being used by people within the sort of US-led or EU-led bloc. In fact, the SEZs being created inside of, here's one, Alabuga Special Economic Zone in the middle of Russia, being used to construct drones for the ongoing war with Ukraine, and bringing in workers from sub-Saharan Africa and describing it as a kind of a development project. So young Africans head to Russia's Alabuga despite Ukrainian airstrike threats, and this is used as sort of positive PR in ways that are very consistent with a lot of the kind of UN development program stuff actually from the 90s as well. Another interesting place, this is perhaps one of the more elegant examples of how the SEZ can transform over time. I recently had a translation of this book in Korean, and they asked me to write a preface, and at first I dreaded it because no one likes to have to return to books they've already finished. But then I started looking into it, and Korea turns out to be a really interesting place for SEZs. Why? Because North Korea created a couple of SEZs close to the DMZ in the early 2000s. And the idea here was it would be a kind of version of détente or Ostpolitik happening, whereby South Korean companies would use cheap North Korean labor, and North Korean laborers would increase their quality of life. And over time, there would be a sort of softening of tensions, and you'd be able to use the SEZs to kind of bring the North closer to the South. It only lasted for a couple of years, but recently there's been a real revival of the special economic zones along the Russian border in the north, and specifically because they're being used now as a kind of way to get around sanctions. So Russia will import oil to North Korea. The oil will go to China. Will go to China, and then troops now and weapons will leave the SEZ in the north. So once again, I think especially in this world of sort of hardening blocs, sanctions, trade wars, SEZs can often offer kind of like loopholes, workarounds, important kind of forms in which there can be a subversion of this supposed move towards ironclad economic distinctions. This is an example of something that I think is helpful to understand how an emirate like Dubai has managed to have its steep upward trajectory in the last 25 years, and to have become, I think, really one of the models for authoritarian leaders globally. Certainly Trump, I think, probably sees his counterpart most closely in places like Dubai, speculative real estate driven, autocratic, highly instrumental in how it opens up to the world economy, willing to accept but then fire and deport workers as necessary, enchanted with high levels of gold and glitz and extreme levels of conspicuous consumption, prestige wrestling, prestige UFC, golf, and soccer events. There's a lot of ways that I think we should not be looking to 1930s Germany or 1930s Italy to understand someone like Trump. We should be looking to 2025 Dubai or Saudi Arabia, Riyadh. Dubai partially has been successful by also following the Chinese model in retracing the steps of an earlier global imperial British force and taking over the management and sometimes the ownership of ports globally. So everywhere from Vancouver, I'm from Victoria right there, down to Australia. There was a recent opening in Peru and Dubai. This has become a kind of way to globalize Dubai's economic power in a way that is not even, but is highly concentrated and based on a highly technical knowledge, which is operating basically container ports, which has a high barrier to entry. It has a kind of very long time horizon because the contracts that are being signed are also often for 99 or 45 years. And a geography that we often don't think about as being definitive, but I think really is. One example of how this comes home, and I mentioned this in the conclusion to my book, is that P&O shipping lines, P&O ferry lines, which was once a grand British imperial shipping line, was purchased by DP World. And they were running the ferry services between parts of the British Isles. And 2 years ago, overnight, they fired the entire workforce. And people were shocked. How can you do this under British labor laws? Well, they weren't under British labor laws. They're owned by a Dubai company, flagged here, registered there, and they live actually offshore, even though their whole function was moving people from parts of the UK to another. They said they would rehire everybody, but at lower than British minimum wage, and that there was no choice but to kind of accept that compromise. So these are some of the ways that fully offshoring competitiveness and governance can kind of come home. A last example I want to show here is the way that India, which for a long time was not competitive in this space of creating long distance supply chains or governing kind of logistics corridors, has now very aggressively made a move, partially behind the close partnership between Adani special economic zones and Modi himself, and in an attempt now to effectively do their own version of the Belt and Road Initiative, but with a more friendly government than the Chinese, so one more welcome to the United States and the EU. They've recently announced what's called the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, which links Gujarat and Mumbai through the kind of export processing zone of Jebel Ali in Dubai, through Saudi Arabia, Riyadh, and then notably, the most important part of the link is through Haifa, which now has a port that is managed by Adani Special Economic Zones and ports as of recently. On to Piraeus, which, as most people probably know, managed by COSCO, a Chinese state-adjacent construction company. So some people have wondered why India as a country and Modi as a person had seemingly done such a strong pivot in the relationship to the Palestinian cause in particular. There seemed to be a kind of foursquare solidarity with Netanyahu against the Palestinians, even though over the decades India was usually at least giving some verbal expression of sympathy for the Palestinian people. Well, a kind of a material story that you can tell through something like the new corridor of zones here can help explain some of the rationale behind decisions like that too. I don't have images of it, but you can find also quite striking plans that came out of Netanyahu's office last year for a new free trade zone in demolished Gaza. And they used DALL-E to create AI-generated images of sort of sparkling skyscrapers, people in dish dashes, and whole parking lots full of Teslas that would now become a kind of a node connecting the future free trade zone of Neom in the south that they're building, multi-$100 million project, with the corridor of transport and real estate investment and luxury real estate that would connect them onwards to Europe. So this, I guess, is where I would like to end the talk by sort of suggesting that we can, I think, properly challenge, complicate, undermine these three governing theses of post-Cold War history by looking through the glasses of the zone. The idea that everything was moving upwards until 2016, then when suddenly geoeconomic fragmentation kicked in, is nonsense. There was actually functional fragmentation the whole time. There was the building out of a complex legal geography inside of nations, often for the utility of nations themselves, in the sort of honeycomb of zones in the 90s and afterwards. The end of history thesis is obviously, long since debunked. Francis Fukuyama himself wrote The End of History, ? 1989. The next article he published was titled Asia's Soft Authoritarian Alternative. And it was about Singapore. It was about pre-reform Taiwan. It was about pre-democratic South Korea, and saying, actually, these places work pretty good too. And they actually don't have proper contested multi-party elections. And they seem to have a lot of legitimacy both domestically and internationally. So he effectively undermined the cliche version of his argument almost immediately, which is to the credit of Fukuyama, who's I think actually much sharper than people give him credit for. But since then, and this is a wonderful part for me in the discovery and the research for the book, 90s and 2000s, there was an effort to do more nation branding. Maybe people remember this, like Incredible India. Everyone's country probably had their own version. I remember it was Supernatural British Columbia, or in the province I'm from. One of the discoveries, I read this in the trade journals of the nation branders, was they asked the question, does it matter to you in your opinion of this country if they're democratic or not? And the answer was a resounding no. So the top two, the best brands for nations in the world in the early 2000s were Dubai and Singapore. People were voting with their feet. Obviously, French tourists vote with their tourist dollars all the time. British people go in great hordes to Dubai. So the non-democratic capitalism wasn't even a kind of a spectral threat off in the distance. It was literally like the place that holidaymakers would choose to go to and revel in. So clearly there's been a robust history of alternatives to democratic capitalism since then. Thirdly, and this moves more into the speculative, and I'll have to end there because we don't have time for the full cast of anarcho-capitalist characters I introduce in the book, but there are people who have been inspired by this kind of everyday circuitry of the global economy that the SEZ is, into asking themselves, what if this could be something more than just a kind of functional part of investments, manufacturing, tax avoidance? What if we could use the zone as a model for undoing representative governments and the nation-state model itself altogether, and produce a completely privatized mosaic of competing, admission-only, nations by consent, as Murray Rothbard described it in the 1990s. The fact that we have at least one head of state, Javier Milei, who is a declared anarcho-capitalist and sees Murray Rothbard, until recently a totally marginal character I even hesitated to include in my book, as his personal intellectual guru, shows us like kind of how far down the rabbit hole of that one we've gone. So I think I'll leave it there and just be interested to hear your responses and questions.
Thank you. First, thank you so much. And I wanted perhaps to start with, perhaps we can start with the end, of the talk and the kind of the fascinating, I guess, okay, perhaps with the fascinating idea of the how you call it, the perforation of the zone. And in the book, you spend a lot of time, writing about the dreams and the visions of different strands of libertarian thinkers and anarcho-capitalists and so on. And so I two things. One, I think I was curious to hear you tell us a bit more about.
He wants you to just put it on your collar there, I think.
So I was curious if you could perhaps tell us a bit more about that history that you tell in the book, and second, because it plays such a central part in your argument, and second, if you could tell us a little bit more about kind of beyond their dreams and their visions, what have been their real successes, their real achievements. At some point today, so you mentioned I thought that was very intriguing, the Freeport, in the UK, and you said yourself, you say, well, it's been a failure, right? There's just one that has panned out. It's Canary Wharf, but all the rest, is just a big failure. And so, what do you think, at the end of the day, has been the real influence of these thinkers?
Sure. Yeah, so I think I can answer that in two ways. And one is that the book explores a series of what you could call kind of interesting but failed experiments. And they include the attempt by a Dutch libertarian in the middle of the Somali civil war to create what he called a white man's business clan. So used Somali law, which had no state, it's totally just two individuals and a judge, and tried to create a contract so that people could come and invest in what was then more or less stateless Somalia and produce things under normal relationships, but now mediated just through two private actors rather than through a state. There's the example that I use of a place in Honduras that some of you might have heard of called Prospera, which was a kind of quasi-realization of Paul Romer's quite high-profile proposition for a charter city. His idea was that countries would give over ownership and governance of a bit of territory to a foreign country, sort of voluntary recolonization, to allow them to manage it more efficiently, to create credibility for global investors. That didn't pan out, but under an authoritarian government in Honduras, there was a plan to sell a patch of territory to Silicon Valley investors, including, interestingly, Milton Friedman's grandson, Patri Friedman, and to let them indeed write their own laws, have their own courts, design their own police force, and create blank slate legislation for themselves. So that was realized. It exists. You can go there. I know people who have. You can do what Patri Friedman did, which is go down and had his Tesla key implanted in his hand, so he can just open his car by touching his hand to it. The medical and life extension experimentation has now become a core part of the services they offer there, as well as, of course, offshore cryptocurrency exchanges and the like. However, these things were too high profile, too visible, and in a democratic election recently there was an overturning of the laws that make them able to persist there. The response of Honduras has been very interesting, and it shows how the kind of top-level global economic governance actually connects to these small experiments in exit. The response of the avowedly libertarian, even anarcho-capitalist investors has been to turn to the Central American Free Trade Agreement and a bilateral treaty between Kuwait and Honduras to sue the country of Honduras for $10.8 billion, a sizable, if not all of the chunk of the GDP of the country of Honduras. So there's a close kind of allyship, actually, between international economic law and this more or less sometimes successful projects of state exit. So there are these isolated examples, but I find the interest in this topic, especially right now, is less in those small experiments, the way that the gated community is a kind of a laboratory of private law, as Gordon Tullock describes, as I describe in my book, but is more helpful, I think, to ask what the end game is for the current crop of Silicon Valley titans, CEOs, and founders who have now created such a tight alliance with the new president, Donald Trump. The normal way of thinking of what they're doing would be the way that Biden described it in his farewell address. It's a tech industrial complex. It's a project of state capture. You just get federal contracts for Anduril, Palantir, SpaceX, and so on. That is certainly part of it, but the writings of those people themselves, people like Mark Andreessen, people like Thiel, with whom I begin the book, suggest there's another future as well, which is that the project of state capture is actually transitional towards a different project of state exit. And that state exit might be vertical. It might be colonizing Mars. I mean, this is openly what Musk hopes to do as an endgame. But it's more likely, vertical downwards. The decentralization of governance in the United States, the sapping of the federal budget, the avowed deconstruction of the administrative state is in full swing right now, legally and illegally in the United States, which then has the effect of fragmenting the United States into smaller and smaller units of governance. Some of them still public, state level, but some of them more on the model of the company town that I described. So I think that, keeping that option alive in our heads as the kind of longer term goal of many of the people involved, partially because of what they've written and said, it's not, we don't have to imagine much, is for me the kind of payoff, actually, of paying close attention to this development.
Perhaps, a quick follow-up on that, because, at the heart of the book, there is this idea that there is some kind of tension between capitalism and the nation state, right? This idea that capitalism is cracking up nations. And I guess a common alternative view on that is, is it really, the right way to look at this, in the sense that when you look at far-right regimes all over the world, whether it's Modi or whether it's Trump or whether it's Orban, it looks more like a kind of a fusion between the state and the top capitalists, right? When you look at the Trump inauguration, where they're all sitting front row, it's not like we don't have the feeling that they're trying to destroy the state, but more like they're trying to capture it, right, and to use it for their own benefit. So,
can I respond to that?
Yeah, that's my question.
You have been following the news about Musk and the Department of Government Efficiency, I assume. I mean, his claim is to cut $2 trillion from the federal budget. All federal employees, which includes more than 2 million people, received an email last week, which was the same email that all employees of Twitter received after Musk took over Twitter, which said, respond to this email with the word resign, and you will have payment until September, after which you will be terminated. That looks like a pretty serious, at least on paper, mandate or desire to sap all state capacity, at least redirecting it totally from some things it used to do, creating a level playing field for education, guarding basic environmental protection problems, standards, health education on vaccines, towards only a few important tasks, helping pay for AI infrastructure, helping to expand out the military state, helping to push technologies like satellite internet and so on. So I hear what you're saying, but I think that's why I said, is this state capture or state capture for a further goal of state exit? I think we wouldn't want to assume that we're still in the same space of the timeline simply asking for a fusion and settling there, the same way that Lockheed Martin or General Motors had this idea, what's good for General Motors is good for America, and vice versa. This is a cozy symbiosis. Why shake the boat? Elon Musk doesn't speak in the name of the United States. He speaks in the name, neither does Sam Altman. And listen to what he says. He says, this is about humanity. This is about civilization. Increasingly for Musk, this is about Western white civilization. It's not actually a nationalist register of politics. And I think, one can say that's just obfuscation and rhetoric, or you can take them at their word. And I think if you do that, then you need to sort of ask, are they happy? If they were happy with just getting very wealthy, they wouldn't have put their neck out the way they did for Trump. They were getting rich already. I mean, the secular trend, as everyone in this room knows, for billionaires in the United States has been very good through Democratic administrations and Republican administrations. They're doing great. They're doing amazing. So there was some sense of intervening partially, I think, to act as a human shield against Steve Bannon, actually, and keeping ties with China through sort of a bear hug strategy. But also, I think, some other idea of being able to push the political geography in directions that actually hasn't gone before. The annexation of Greenland and the annexation of Panama Canal are examples to me of how assumptions about how the national border operates are somehow suddenly no longer applicable, right? I mean, this is a very, very basic ground rule of the post-war order that he's proposing to break. Arguably, the United States already did it in 2003 and has done it many times in its past. But to say we're taking it and keeping it rather than we're taking it and occupying it for the sake of democracy or whatever is to me a step shift in the form of American power. And I don't think, by the way, that there's a kind of a perfect smoothness between the vision of someone like Trump and annexing Greenland and the kind of crack up idea of private governed communities. I think there actually is a tension there. I think you can't take over an entire subcontinent effectively without expanding out the capacity of the state to administer it, unless you use a total contractor model as they did in Iraq and just farm it all out to private companies, now that I think about it. But anyway, I think this, it's something that came up in the course of the book I didn't really expect to be there, was the Iraq War. Because when Silicon Valley was saying, we have solutions, we can do charter cities, we should do charter schools, we should let private companies actually take care of business because the state is obviously incompetent, there were reasons to believe them, right? I mean, if you looked at the mess that was made of Iraq and Afghanistan, you might ask why you would trust the state with anything and why you shouldn't actually trust corporate actors. Curtis Yarvin, about whom much has been written recently, made this point directly in 2009. He said, okay, on the one hand you have Iraq. Yes, everyone's finger is blue from voting, but it's a basket case, it's corrupt. On the other hand, you have Dubai, glitzy new skyscrapers, wonderful new entertainments, no democracy, but doing well. Which would you prefer? And what he's now proposing, Musk, for example, calls himself inside of the company of Tesla. He's not the CEO, right? You know this? You know his title? Techno King.
Techno King, yes.
He's the Techno King. And that is it's almost a novel ideology, I think, in itself, that perhaps exceeds the pages of the book that I just wrote. But anyway, that's my long-winded answer to your question.
Okay. One more from me, and we can open to the floor. Let's forget about Trump and Musk for a second. Okay, let's think about the period between the financial crisis of 2008-2009 and just before Trump too. I think during those 15 years, and we've studied that here at the observatory, there's been some real progress in international economic cooperation to kind of curtail precisely the zones, to tame the forces of tax competition and financial opacity and offshore. So there's been the automatic exchange of bank information in 2017, very important. In 2021, there was an agreement on a minimum tax for multinational companies, 15%, very weak in many ways, but still more than 0%. Last year, we worked a lot to put on the agenda at the G20, working with Brazil, the idea of a minimum coordinated tax on billionaires. So my question for you is all of this doomed? Where is this going? You've studied our opponents, so to speak, and are they so powerful, or can you give us a little bit of hope?
Sure. Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, history is a field of struggle, and I also write my books that way. I mean, the stories that I've produced here maybe don't always include the kind of moments of confrontation with alternative visions of organizing political economy, alternative visions of organizing international order. There's a reason why the new international economic order in the 70s was so central and globalist, because I think it was a completely comprehensively different way of organizing the world rather than prioritizing strictly capital security and free trade. It said, political economy can be many things. What if it's all these other things? Almost each of these chapters is set up as a confrontation between some kind of democratic mobilization and a grassroots effort to put the brakes on or radically transform what's being rolled out. It begins in Hong Kong with Milton Friedman and Deng Xiaoping, but it ends in Hong Kong too in 2019 with this extremely brave uprising of students and everyday citizens who were trying to retain their understanding of the place they lived and the civil freedoms and political freedoms that they enjoyed, even if that did always fall short of universal suffrage. So I 100% am on your page with the idea that the future is not written. The reason to do history is to recover possible futures that did not come to pass, but by returning to them, we can take the spirit of that time and help to bring it up to date for the moment. And I don't think it's at all sort of foreordained that this vision will come to pass. I think it's wise to have it at least in mind as one of the possible things towards which people are driving, so as not to misrecognize the enemy. I think if you think your enemy is just a return of 1930s style fascism, then you might be missing all the ways that actually an accelerated individualist capitalism is actually helping to give legitimacy and consent and kind of a motor to this stuff. And I think it was, and we were talking about this briefly before, but this book came out in English in 2023 and in German in 2023 as well. And at that time, when I went to Germany and did similar talks, people were kind of like, oh, Americans are so weird, right? or like, this is something in China or Honduras, but it's not important for us. I mean, what could this strange ideology mean in the middle of nice, safe, stable, still somewhat social democratic Europe, right? It's harder now to sort of cultivate that insulated image of Europe as somehow free of those kind of pressures. And the vision of kind of defection from the margins, the Maloney-Musk arrangement about Starlink, for example, the interest of people like Orban in playing both sides with Russia, China, and the rest of the EU, suggests here also an erosion of economic unity from the edges. I think Musk's alliances with far-right leaders like Alice Weidel in Germany is his attempt, as I've written, to find the sort of the Teslas of politics. So the same way that no one ever thought Chevrolet and Ford or General Motors were going anywhere, and they were like institutions that would last 100 years, now Tesla is worth all of them combined. So he's on a similar mission to find political actors and parties who might fill the same function. Telegenic, shocking, interesting, shiny new objects. If he backs them, then he creates chaos in the EU, harder to have a united front against the Trump-Musk kind of tag team. And then he maybe creates a patron-client relationship with future leaders of those states themselves. So if Weidel and Maloney already is in power, now you've got a ready-made partner for your own kind of material rollout. So I wish we were still in a more optimistic 2023 moment. When I gave this talk, a version of this last night at the Théâtre de la Concorde with Julia Cagé, someone from the audience said, what about the Zuckman tax? So, you represent in a good way, I think, like an alternative vision of international economic law, and it's essential, totally essential to keep that alive and vibrant. And I, actually genuinely thank everyone in this room for being part of that project. It wouldn't be smart or wise or strategically intelligent to only focus on, our opponents solely. You also need to prepare for a defense and a kind of day after plan, because with some luck, there will be an election in the United States in a couple of years, and maybe another one a couple of years after that. And for all of his flaws, I think Biden had a very progressive and radical group of economic advisors inside of the White House. He ran into all kinds of problems of his own making and other people's making. But let's remember that it wasn't so long ago that people at the heights of American economic policy were saying neoliberalism is over and we're going to kill it, right? It seems far from now. This is 4 years ago. And 10,000 votes going the other way would mean we'd be having a totally different conversation. So completely agree with you. And we play both sides of the game, I think.
All right, questions?
In the mic. Okay. Hello. I have a question about a point that I feel like in this topic has not been really discussed. And so my question regarding surveillance. I feel like after Snowden, like the Snowden revelations came out, there was a long discussion about surveillance, and now it seems to be that everyone sort of has accepted that this is the state of the world. And now with the Stargate proposal, I think Larry Ellison, I think that's his name, he mentioned something like, oh, we're gonna, this is great, we can, with AI, we can record everyone and we can process this information very well, and then the police will behave well and everyone will behave well. And I'm just wondering, with this, and also looking at the way that China uses surveillance in their power of over the citizens, how does that go into that? And in a way, can we still have a democratic process if that's sort of the scenario that we're heading towards?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not for nothing that so many kind of terms from the Cold War have returned to contemporary politics, right? The idea of an AI arms race is something we hear about now almost every day. And remember, the logic of the arms race in the first Cold War was kind of like, you need to produce an enormous arsenal of nuclear weapons to prevent your enemy from doing to you what you will be able to credibly do to them, right? So the notion of kind of mutually assured destruction is a kind of like mise en abîme of like nihilism on the one hand, but also has a kind of rationale to it. I think something similar is happening with AI. So if you read Peter Thiel from a couple of years ago, I cite him on this in the conclusion. He says basically we have two real threats right now which we didn't see 20 years ago. One is AI, and the other one is China. And we need to master one to kind of defeat the other. But as with the kind of Jean Le Carré vision of like, you and I are not so different, looking at the kind of partner, I think Thiel sees a vision of China that is absolute, authoritarian, highly centralized, no division between private and public power. And rather than saying, that's bad, I don't want to do that, he's like, that's what we have to do as well, right? So it's this Cold War logic of needing to kind of meet your adversary on the same territory that you understand them, sometimes falsely, to be standing on, that has, you know, shredded now any remaining kind of reservations about personal security of data and things like that. So that's the way I see it, is they have this maximalist idea now of the only way you win the AI arms race is by feeding, you know, your models as much data as they can possibly eat. And so there's no defense if they've declared, you know, all the data equals saved civilization, less data equals civilization dies, right? They've set up a kind of a game-like relationship in which they will win every time if people accept their logic. So I also have been startled by the loss of any real concern about those things since the Snowden moment just a decade ago. The fact that the spaces within which we might build opposition and hash out strategies and talk about alternatives is now owned literally by, in the case of X, Elon Musk, is, you know, all the more depressing and suggests not only the need to rethink international economic law, but also rethink spaces of media communication that can somehow not be entirely subordinate to the sort of scraping and analytic logic that we currently operate with. I mean, it's something that from a distance, if you looked at it, would seem absolutely insane and absurd. That, you know, people like us in the room will like go on X every day and just be like, look at Musk, what an idiot, what a fascist, look where he's going. You're like, you're in his house, like you're working for him. You're volunteering your labor for him with every time you curse him out. It is really disgusting, actually, the way we've been co-opted into that ourselves.
Hi, thanks a lot for your intervention. I have two questions. Listen to your talk, I was reminding Fernand Braudel, and for him he defined capitalism as a system where they always looking at the cracks, at the gray zones, besides markets. Yeah. And I was wondering if you take back your view not only at the 20th century, but the broader beginning of capitalism, what if the 20th century was just a parenthesis between like the real capitalism, which always try to see the cracks and the gray zones and the far away and that sometimes use public authorities or state to do that. That's the first question. And the second one is more speculative. I was wondering if it could be an opportunity for all the thinkings of the commons, of municipalism, anarchist in the good way of anarchism, I mean like communism, to say, okay, the state is going maybe down, and we can take gray zones as way of developing on communist institutions. I know it's very speculative, but maybe it's a way of turning this as from a threat to opportunity. Thank you.
Yeah, I think those are both really great questions. I think the Braudel one is something I've thought about a lot, and I think another way of answering the question is to say, what is the kind of natural legal order for capitalism? Is it one of kind of homogeneity and evenness, where there's one rule for the world economy, which was the assumption of the WTO, that is what is best serves the interests of efficiency, overall productive allocation of resources, is you have one rule and you can come to the court and say, you know, Hayek called it isonomy. There needs to be a sort of a same law. Or is the natural, more suitable law approach for capitalism one of pluralism, which is what the 19th century was, and certainly centuries before were, where you actually did arbitrage between different empires, between different kinds of territories inside of empires, concessions, treaty ports, you know, hinterlands, different legal arrangements, mostly designed to make commercial relations work more smoothly for the people involved. I definitely, and Vanessa Ogle has written about this, I don't know if she's already come or she will come, but she's also written about what she calls archipelago capitalism, as indeed sort of returning us more to a model of empire sort of ruling through difference, rather than this 20th century parentheses, as you say, in which there was some goal of evenness or sameness. On your second point, I completely agree with you. The Greater London Council, which I mentioned in reference to Canary Wharf, had this idea that my friend Katrina Forrester is now writing a whole book about, which is the idea of working in and against the state. So they were politicians, effectively, elected representatives at a local level, but they were also trying to create kind of parallel institutions of self-aid or mutual aid, doing things like workshops on socially useful technology already in the early 1980s, organizing recently arrived immigrants, offering daycare services, doing translation, doing things that the government did not see and either had the capacity or interest in doing at the time. So these were not quite anarchist approaches, but they were sort of attempts at doing municipal socialism at even a kind of neighborhood level and a smaller scale. And there's nothing crazy about the history of municipal socialism. And Fabianism is a long and storied tradition. We're sitting here in Paris, obviously. No one needs to be reminded of the city as a space of alternative politics. And I wholeheartedly agree with you. So I think we need to work at both scales, both the kind of model of transforming international economic law, sure. Will you ever get buy-in enough to something like an OECD global corporate minimum tax for it to actually make a difference? Hard to say, it's not an easy road. Organizing locally, in decommodified ways, transforming relations between people, perhaps equally important, maybe more important as kind of alternative laboratories also for a different kind of politics.
Two questions, maybe one which kind of goes back to kind of Gabriel's first question. If you believe kind of optimism case, if you believe kind of a Polanyi reading of history, when things go very far in the way of market, then society has a way to strike back. So is there a way of the story where society strikes back and rebuilds protections, etc.? The second question is more about those institutions that seem to be decaying, that the institutions that link the world together, like the WTO, are not needed anymore in the way of the FSCs. will and that can go back. Will the Bretton Woods institution survive Trump? ISDS, investor-state disputes, are those still necessary in a world where you can have SECs and bureaus?
Yeah, so on the first one, in the introduction to globalists, which I mentioned, I actually directly take issue with what I think is a kind of a vulgar version of Polanyi that has become quite common, which is actually the pendulum idea, that disembeddedness goes too far, tries to turn people into completely abstract, exchangeable entities like goods, and then there is a kind of a double movement where society strikes back and it re-embeds people. And warning, that can sometimes be right-wing or it can be left-wing, and National Socialism was effectively right-wing double movement. I think that's actually maybe the exact argument I'm arguing against. I think precisely that assumption that there's something natural about the movement from more global to more embedded, more global to more embedded, not at all. The point of the zone logic is that you can swing to global and then the pendulum goes further into a direction. The pendulum flies right off the handle, and it works through a form of a double movement, which it's not even helpful to use Polanyi's categories to understand anymore. So, he was a scholar of medieval economies, actually, and West African pre-contact economies. And this world of kind of pluralism and small enclaves with different legal arrangements is very familiar to him in his own writing, but I don't think he quite predicted that could be a way that an ever more modern and progressive society could transform sort of back to, so to speak. I think he saw the two options, either the nation protects itself or the nation sort of abstracts itself. So I think I'm actually trying to add to that Polanyian vocabulary, but definitely not agreeing with it. As far as the second question goes, I think the example of Prospera answers that question, that in fact these visions of private cities and state exit are in practice still dependent on that top level international institutional protection. One of the reasons why I think the last 8 years have been interesting politically is that what I think happened in 2016 was Bernie Sanders actually disrupted the free trade consensus, eventually forced Hillary Clinton to also pick up his talking points. Once Sanders was out, Bannon very cleverly saw that was winning consensus and landing with people, and so effectively just pushed that towards Trump. Trump doesn't give a shit about this stuff. He doesn't care about like Polanyian re-embedding. He just cares about where the best real estate deals are. Look at what's his son-in-law doing? Buying up the Albanian coast, working with the Saudis to find like new opportunities in NEOM. He'll build a line of condos in Gaza as soon as they have a means of getting everyone out of there. However, Sanders, Bannon, in a bastardized way, also had an idea of you need to repoliticize global trade and stop acting like globalization is a force of nature to which you can only surrender yourself in the Tony Blair, Gerhard Schröder model. So what did Trump's trade representative, Robert Lighthizer, do? Well, he tried to, in some ways did, got rid of parts of the ISDS, Investor State Dispute Settlement Arrangement. He did put in clauses into the USMCA, the new NAFTA with Mexico, about labor conditions inside of Mexican factories. Was that a disingenuous way to undercut Mexican competitiveness? Maybe. But it was also like a reopening of these kind of discussions. Like, what is trade for? What can tariffs do? What can overseas relationships be other than just bottom line economic relationships? So I think that has been a positive outcome, actually, of the Trump disruption. Obviously, the Biden team just picked it up and ran with it in a different direction while continuing the same overall trajectory. If this all ends in the annexation of Greenland and a new global war, I'll have to certainly eat my words. But from where I sit, I think it has still opened up the possibility of creative reinvention of global economic order rather than its inevitable destruction, which is certainly how it's often described.
Professor? Professor Slobodian, thank you very much. I'm a very great fan of your work. I'd like to hear more from you on taxation, more specifically international taxation, if I may. Going back to the dichotomy you showed us between imperium and dominion, if I'm not mistaken, you attribute that rhetoric to the ICC in your first book on globalists. And I'd like to connect that with two very important moments in the history of the international tax debate. The first one in the League of Nations, in which the ICC had a very important participation, and in which international taxation was depicted as a barrier to international commerce. And second one in the late 1990s, in the context of the e-commerce debate that after that became the digital economy debate, in which the first most important event on subject was named international taxation as a barrier to e-commerce or something like that. Do you trace any parallel between these dichotomy between imperium versus dominion and this so-called dichotomy between international taxation and I'm talking about revenue taxation, because consumption taxation was already something very common in international relations. Do you see any parallel between these revenue taxation versus this rhetoric on free commerce or free commerce and free e-commerce in the late 9th centuries and the dominion versus imperium dichotomy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the basic idea of wanting to encase or enshrine free capital movements would also include the right to domicile your company wherever you like, wherever the tax arrangement is most hospitable and most, conducive to your interests. So I think at a basic level, sure, the idea of like creating a taxation sort of choke point at the moment of crossing border, or forcing people to, pay taxes for the activity place that they do most of their business, is kind of against what one of my actors calls the human right of capital flight. In the Globalist book, I had this Romanian lawyer who quite seriously and with some traction with Philip Jessup, who's one of the fathers of transnational law, tries to get the right to take money out of countries as part of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Drafts things for it and stuff. So there is that idea, especially within Ordo Liberals, and Switzerland has often made reference to this tradition of freedom from persecution by the freedom of being able to take your money where you want, and thereby shop for the tax jurisdiction you prefer. The thing that I find most amazing as a kind of accomplishment of this project is from the first Trump administration, actually, when the Heritage Foundation posted this meme that showed the US corporate tax rate, and then it showed the corporate tax rate of Mauritius. And Mauritius, I believe, was 15% at the time, and the US was whatever it was, 35. And this was used polemically as a call to lower American corporate tax rates. But what an insane comparison, right? Like, how have they managed to create their own rhetorical universe where you could take a place that small and put it next to a place like the United States and suggest that that has some, ammunition inside of it for changing the conduct of domestic governments? And yet, it worked, right? I mean, the person who was doing that was a guy named Stephen Moore, who helped design the 2017 tax cuts, which would have been expiring this year were it not for the victory of Trump. So yeah, no, I mean, I get your question. I haven't tracked the specific intellectual story of people mostly concerned with taxation of international revenue, but certainly there would be the same set of discussions about freedom of dominion, the efficiencies that are discovered by the tax competition regime. One thing I do think is quite important that I talk about in the book, that Milton Friedman was actually quite central to as well, was his feeling that in the Cold War people were too obsessed with democracy, too obsessed with political freedom. And so the Freedom House rankings, which if anyone's a political scientist has probably heard of, is commonly used as a kind of indicator for freedom generally in countries. And they had this workshop, Friedman, Charles Murray, Peter Bauer, others. And they asked the guy from Freedom House, how do you determine how free a country is anyway? And he said, well, mostly contested multi-party elections. And they said, well, what about low taxation and ease of opening business and ability to take money out of the country? And he's like, well, you don't actually include that. And they're like, oh, okay, then we're going to make our own. And so they made an index of economic freedom, which is now published by the Wall Street Journal and Cato Institute and Heritage Foundation is actually 2 of these things. And keep an eye out for it. Reading the financial press, you'll see it reported. Singapore takes #1 for the freest economy in the world. Hong Kong was #1 for 35 years until they were removed because they're now considered to be part of China. But low taxation is almost the most important indicator there for a different view of the world map, which is just a world of economic rather than political freedom.
All right, our time is up and there's a class at 2. So let me first thank the organizers of the Offshore Talk lecture series, Julia Aliprandi and Mathilde Auburtin in particular, and Nino, of course, Mark Kessler. Thank you so much to all of you for your presence, and most importantly, thank you so much, Quinn, for a wonderful lecture and discussion.